Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. We're on the road to the Green Dragon Inn, and you're on the road to understanding more about the life of Gandalf with Dr. Alison Milbank. Let's dive in. As we continue our Tolkien's Greatest Characters series, I am overjoyed to have Alison Milbank joining us from near Sherwood Forest, as I hear. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Lovely. Could you, before we get into all the rich details of Tolkien's world, I'd love to hear a little bit about the great details of your own life there in England and what you're up to and kind of, I don't know, what you're passionate about these days.
Well, I've just retired as Professor of Theology and Literature at the University of Nottingham, which will enable me, of course, to do more writing. But I'm an Anglican priest, and I'm still the Canon Theologian at this great big cathedral in the middle of the little town I live in. And I'm working on a book about divine immanence in Anglican nature writing, and a little book for Cambridge on theology and literature.
Oh, sounds just lovely. Wow. Could you tell me a little bit about the castle that you referenced?
Well, that's more of it. There's a castle at Newark, just down the river, the River Trent. And what we have is a medieval cathedral. But it's full of woodland creatures and carvings and green men with sort of leaves coming out of their mouths. It's all very Sherwood Foresty.
And before I get distracted easily, as you'll discover, but I would love to hear more about that topic as you're talking about the writing with nature. It sounds like during that time period there was a lot more, would the word be oneness or, as you said, immanence? I'm not sure. What would you describe the approach to nature that it differs from today?
Well, in the Middle Ages, nature was God's book. So everything in the natural world had a symbolic resonance, and anything could lead you to God. So we've got all sorts of monsters on the outside of our cathedral, and on the inside too, dragons and so on. But the idea is that these are symbols of God's power. So everything tells you about God. And so there's a much more mediated understanding of the natural world as also having a kind of moral character. You see this in Tolkien too, of course, where creatures are kind of moral agents often. But certainly in the Middle Ages, you would look at, I don't know, a lion, and it would teach you about the vice of pride, but it might also teach you positive moral virtues. So everything was symbolic.
That's
and obviously
beautiful.
they were a lot closer to nature.
Yeah, there's is reverence the right word for nature that existed in those periods? Yeah.
I mean, obviously they're also quite frightened by things that we now can appreciate aesthetically. So, it's a long while before mountains come to be seen as things you might want to climb for pleasure. I know Dante does at the beginning of Inferno, but that's because it's the divine mountain.
We'll make an exception for that one. Well, I'd love to hear about your own journey with Tolkien. How did you first discover him? What was that experience like, and how has it been since?
Well, I read The Hobbit as a little girl. I was particularly keen on the cover. It was the cover that drew me, particularly when you pull it out and everything leads to the mountain. So I enjoyed The Hobbit as a child. I then, as a teenager, tried to read Lord of the Rings, and I got stuck on the birthday party. And I thought, what is this? I didn't realise that this was a deliberate strategy for taking you beyond the childlike world into this darker reality. So I didn't really read Tolkien again until my children read him for themselves. And that's why I dedicated my book on Tolkien and Chesterton to my children, because it was when we were in America that I read him and I was blown away. It was so different from what I'd assumed. I think I assumed it was all fighting. And of course, the battle scenes are also stylized. They're so hieratic and there's a lot more dealing with weather than there is in actual physical encounters of an agonistic sort. So I was really blown away by it. And just immediately when I was reading it, I was asked to do a series of lectures by the Christian Studies Centre in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I lived. And that was a great honour. And that got me really into Tolkien.
How lovely. Can I ask how long were you in Charlottesville?
Nearly 6 years.
Ah,
We
yes.
taught at UVA,
Oh, so nice.
University of Virginia.
Yes, yes. Well known and well regarded university, certainly. And beautiful, beautiful campus, beautiful
It's
part of
gorgeous.
America. Yeah.
Yes, it really is. And I was able to even teach Tolkien as part of my. I taught in the English department, but I was allowed to do religion and literature kind of classes. So I had wonderful students.
Oh, how nice. Can I ask about your book on Tolkien and Chesterton?
Well, it's called Tolkien and Chesterton as Theologians. And I noticed how Tolkien is really quite sniffy about other writers, but that he often quotes Chesterton, and particularly in On Fairy Stories, where he's actually working out his own theory of what fantasy does, particularly what it does theologically. And so I followed up all the different references to Chesterton and looked at the way in which both of them, how they engaged with Jacques Maritain and the kind of revival of Thomism. And I tried also, with my literary hat on, to try and use literary tropes like the grotesque, paradox, things like this to kind of interrogate their theology. So rather than sort of let's hunt the Christ figure, I was looking at how does the actual structure of the work and its stylistics, its tropes, bear a kind of theological sort of exploration or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Fascinating. Chesterton, for one, as I read him, is overjoyed with paradox. He certainly points it out frequently.
Yes, he rather overdoes it on occasions, sort of piles them up and up and up. But it was, I mean, obviously it's very different, works very, very differently in Tolkien. But he too is interested in paradoxical characters. It's very unfair to say that Tolkien gives you one dimensional characters. He gives a kind of paradoxical duality to almost everybody. And I think that's very important. And he's interested in riddles. He's interested, a paradox depends ultimately on now we see in a glass darkly, but then face to face, the fact that our whole existence is a riddle. And so it's things like that that I was following up.
Very nice. Well, speaking of riddles and speaking of characters, shall we discuss the character that you've chosen to present today? Could you tell me who you chose and why?
Choose Gandalf. I was amazed nobody had chosen him before because for me, he is so much at the heart of the story. In fact, even when he's not there, people are often referring to him as Sam does on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. Even when they think he's dead, he's still a huge presence. And that was one of the main reasons. And also because he is obviously one of the characters that links very much to the Silmarillion and to the kind of theological underpinning of the story. That's not made clear in the novel. But I
Mm.
like it all the more for that.
Yeah, well, I'd love for you to maybe touch on that. What is and as you know, the Silmarillion is not nearly as widely read, and the audience for this series is by and large lay people, certainly people who are passionate about the work of Tolkien, but I think you bring a great deal of insight if you could bridge the gap between those for us.
So the Silmarillion gives you the kind of the stories, the kind of legends, the kind of sort of symbolic order behind Lord of the Rings. And the fact that when you read the novel, you're aware of all these mysterious depths is part of its power. It's difficult to read. It's not like a novel. It's a whole series of kind of legendary and mythological tales. But Gandalf is a Maya, one of the Istari, which means he's a wizard. But his real essence is angelic. That's the nearest analogy that we can make. So he is an angel who takes on human form. And at one point he says he is a servant of the secret fire. The secret fire is there in the first chapter of the Silmarillion, the fire Ea, which out of which the god figure, Eru or Iluvatar, creates the world. It is the fire of being. And so Gandalf has this incredible kind of backstory, but of course half this time he is a kind of comical wizard who you employ to give fireworks shows. And people aren't aware of this kind of angelic nature.
Thank you. Well, something springs to my mind is the admonition from the Apostle Paul to be kind to strangers, for you may be entertaining angels unaware.
Very important. It's exactly what it's like. And in fact, I think, I haven't really read this anywhere, but my theory is that he's very much based on the Archangel Raphael in the book of Tobit, which for Catholics, of course, is deuterocanonical. For Protestants, it's part of the Apocrypha. But, you know, a story where a little boy, Tobias, goes on a journey to gain healing and various other things for his father. And unawares, he is helped all the time by a servant who is really the Archangel Raphael. There's a wonderful painting of it in the National Gallery that Tolkien will probably have known by Verrocchio, where there's a little dog as well. And so he's protected by Raphael, he's guided by Raphael. Raphael leads him to a marriage. Now, obviously, all that is divided out in Lord of the Rings. You know, Frodo doesn't get married, but Aragorn does. But the angel incarnate idea is definitely, it seems to me, from Raphael, who is kind of ordered about, you know, because he is. And that happens to Gandalf sometimes, you know. We can get quite tetchy.
What are some of your favorite moments in Gandalf's journey through the Lord of the Rings?
I quite like his relationship with Gwaihir, the eagle. And it gets deeper. I mean, they're very short little scenes, but obviously the eagle rescues him from Saruman's tower, and then the eagle does the rescuing for Sam and Frodo later on. And at one point the eagle says, I mean, to begin with, it's in The Hobbit, of course, where, you know, where the eagle's kind of, you know, well, I'll take them this far and no further. But, you know, Gandalf's got a relationship with them. But by the height of the Lord of the Rings, Gwaihir says something like, I would carry you as far as ever you wanted to go. I would carry you anywhere. And I like that relationship across different orders of being, the beasts and the angels, through a kind of human incarnation. It's kind of, I find it quite touching, and as I may have indicated already, I'm very keen on the way that Tolkien animates the natural world. Gives it agency.
Is it too much for me to read into it to maybe reference that as even Edenic?
Yes, it is very, very much, and it's a kind of unfallen relationship. And although in some sense in the Silmarillion the world that is created has already taken the fall into account, or at least the world out of which Middle Earth develops has this already fallen quality thanks to the fall of one of the higher angels, but that is taken up into the music of creation. So in that sense there's a fallenness, but there's no suggestion that the Vala themselves, the angels who don't fall, are fallen, even though in his human form Gandalf seems very human. You know, he can be impatient and get cross and things like this. But you're right, it's about an Edenic relationship when you are in fellowship and you can name creatures truly and recognize them, and that naming is a relational knowledge.
That's lovely. I perpetually am drawn back to a quote that I read that was attributed to C.S. Lewis with respect to animals speaking in the tales that he wrote. And he just pointed out the similarities between newborns and small children to animals with respect to their need for others to care for them and their positioning in the household and the familiarity that they have with one another at that level, and perhaps there's something that is primordial even to us, calling us back to those types of relationships with nature.
Well, it's interesting, of course, that nature cares for Gandalf. You know, it isn't, I mean, his vocation is to care for small things, but he relies on the angels. Sorry, the eagles. All these feathered creatures, all confused.
So much to keep track of out there. As you mentioned, Gandalf can exhibit truly human tendencies or attributes, and I love that about him. I think that's probably, well, I'm prone to hyperbole, but one of my favorite things, obviously, about Jesus, about Christ, is his humanity because of how it comforts me and draws me closer. I'm curious about Gandalf's interaction that stand out to you as, human moments or whatever you'd like to speak to that.
Well, you see the human side of him very much in relation to Pippin. I mean, he is quite patient with Pippin, who does really stupid things. But, it's the immortal words, fool of a took, kind of Gandalf's. And I like the way that he both comforts Pippin after he's looked in the Palantir and done all these ghastly things, and helps him to grow by taking him to be a kind of page or knight or whatever to bound man, to Denethor. But he's also quite comic in relation to Pippin. And that's a nice kind of human side of him. I also like the moment when he says, it's an incredibly serious moment when he's about to descend with the Balrog into the bowels of Maria. And he says, again, he says, fools, fly, you fools, just as he falls. Which can almost, I remember in the film when I was in the cinema, people actually laughed at that moment. And there is something about it that is on the edge. It's very kind of ambiguous, but it is his sort of, I'm making the ultimate sacrifice, you might as well take advantage of it. that is very, very attractive. And I like it when he brings Theoden King back to life too, in quite a kind of human way, because in a sense he does kind of trick him by bringing his staff in so that he can do some magic. So that's another human side, if you like. I mean, it's necessary. He's got to rescue him, but it's certainly a human side.
Such a rich character. And, you referenced his connection or his origins in the Silmarillion, his nature. What is your inkling with respect to Tolkien's maybe archetypes, either literary, mythologically? Obviously, Tolkien was bound and determined to create a mythology for his beloved land. What comes to mind when you think about corollaries to Gandalf in the broader world or history?
Well, I think there are two. I think Merlin and Odin. Merlin particularly because he is so much part of our mythology anyway in Britain. He's particularly Welsh in origin, but I think it's Geoffrey of Monmouth and later writers like Malory bring him into the Arthurian stories. And obviously he's a slightly more ambiguous figure there because there's even a suggestion that he might even have been the Antichrist, and he has a kind of demonic incubus father, but he gets baptized. But, he acts to Arthur. He is Arthur's guide, Arthur's teacher. I mean, it's a bit sad because I get all my versions muddled up, but in one version he ends up, in a spell inside a tree because he has rather too much of a predilection for young women, and they get his spells and then kind of do the spells on him. I think Morgan Le Fay does that too in one version. But definitely Merlin would seem to me to be a huge influence on Gandalf, and for our idea of what a wizard is. Michael Scott is another one that Sir Walter Scott makes quite a lot of in his poems, and James Hogg in his novels, so that, he's supposed to have changed the landscape in the Scottish borders. But then I think Odin, obviously, particularly in the way that Odin is a god, the god of wisdom, kind of hangs on a tree to gain wisdom for days on end, but also goes around in disguise with, a pointy hat and a long beard. Mind you, all wizards have pointy hats and long beards. But I think the association with wisdom is particularly Odinist. Prophecy, I think, comes from Merlin particularly, because Merlin was a prophet, and his prophecies live after him, and that's something, of course, that Gandalf does too. He does act in a slightly prophetic way in The Lord of the Rings. So he's a much more positive Merlin, and obviously a much more positive Odin, who is quite limited.
I'd love to ask. Sorry, go ahead.
No, carry on.
We're doing pretty well for being across the ocean from one another. I have two thoughts that are triggered by your comments, and one is if you could give for this American who is poorly educated, that being me, what is the time period of Merlin's appearance in British lore?
Well, he's in Welsh lore quite early on. He appears in various places, and his name may mean madman. And there's this sort of sense of his kind of prophetic, almost shamanistic. He's quite a shamanistic figure. We're talking sort of 12th century before he really makes it into the British, sort of the English mythos. But then he's associated with all sorts of parts of the country, including Scotland. But in some of the written texts, Norman writers write about him and Malory writing about him. So all the way through the Middle Ages, right up to the 15th century, He's part of the myth.
Thank you so much.
And of course, C.S. Lewis brings him into that hideous strength, where he is a slightly ambiguous and almost embarrassing figure because he comes from an ancient age and has rather different ethic from the polite Christians of the 1940s.
Yes, truly. My second question is connected to Odin and the tale of him, hanging on the tree. There's so much symbolism there. Is it fair for me to take away an aspect from that there's something in suffering that gives us wisdom, that gives us a new dimension?
It's certainly true. Though of course, it's his own choice to hang on the tree. He's not been put there by somebody. But of course, the versions of the stories that we have are written by Christians. This is what's so interesting, that Tolkien writing about a pagan world is analogous with the text that he is studying, like Beowulf, for example, which again, it's written by a Christian writer about a non-Christian society. But in some ways, they may have shaped the way they tell the stories. And yet, you get the impression that they are trying to tell them within their own terms. And of course, there was a period when people in Britain almost allegorized or had some relation to these pagan stories, even when they were Christian, because there are stone crosses, for example, with the binding of Loki, who's a kind of bad hat in Scandinavian mythology, under the cross. So, using the two figures. And other scenes which show other sort of Norse stories. And certainly they have about them a kind of, like the Rohirrim. The Rohirrim really represent that kind of Anglo-Saxon pagan ethic where you give yourself to your doom and you accept it. And in that sense, you give yourself to suffering. But it isn't quite the same. I can't think. I mean, Balder, for example, gets killed again by Loki. So you can think of him in some sense as a kind of Christic figure because he is an innocent. So there are kind of sort of anticipations of Christianity.
Thank you. And am I to understand that there may be some notions from Tolkien's correspondence to the effect that Gandalf was an Odinic wanderer or the wandering sage motif? Do you know anything
Yes,
about that?
yes, it's a letter to the publisher. I think it's something to do with Disney and or some kind of illustration or anyway somebody wanting to show Gandalf in what Tolkien thought was a rather Disneyish kind of way. The rather kind of cute arabesque way in which wizards sort of appear in Disney cartoons. They're quite charming, but they weren't Tolkien's idea of something much darker and more mysterious and more godlike. So, and I mean, these angelic figures in the Silmarillion, they are angelic rather in the manner of Dionysius the Areopagite, the pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, who's probably a 6th century Syrian writer who writes a kind of angelology, the celestial hierarchy, where the angels mediate the divine qualities of love, wisdom, and so on. And I mean, in Dante, they are the intelligences within the spheres and so on, so that they have a very powerful role. They're not divine, but it's a very high angelology. And I think Tolkien is showing that in Gandalf. And that's why he wants to make the analogy with Odin in disguise, rather than a kind of cute Disney wizard.
That's, man, there's so, I mean, every time I have these conversations, and I thank you again for your time and your just encouragement, it is a remarkable undertaking that Tolkien has done to create this subcreation, to use his On Fairy Stories language. It's just so inspiring. It's it's hard to wrap one's hands around it, at least for me.
Yes, and I mean, then there's all the language side of it, which I am not an expert on at all. But I mean, just to create all these different languages, and not just that, but they all have analogies and they are very carefully calibrated in relation to actual languages. It's quite mad, really, if you think about it.
That yes, yes. The word obsessed comes to mind often when I think about Tolkien's work. Um, I would love to dive into Gandalf's relationships with Bilbo and Frodo, and what do you see there? What charms you? What makes you laugh? What do you love about those two relationships?
Well, the Bilbo one, of course, begins in The Hobbit, and it's very noticeable how he takes Bilbo out of his bourgeois existence to become a burglar. And I love the way that bourgeois and burglar are kind of allied. They're quite close together linguistically. I think it shocked me when I was a little girl. I was a very proper little girl. And I thought he's taking him off to be a burglar. But of course, it is the fact that he can take the stone and then use it for reconciliation between peoples that frees what could have been quite a static standoff kind of narrative. So with Bilbo, it's quite comic to begin with, and yet it becomes deeper and deeper. And certainly the scene with Bilbo at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, where he coaxes Bilbo, the only person really, apart from Sam, who only has the ring for a very short while, to be a person to be able to give up the ring, and the way that he very, very gently does it is very moving. And the way that he is aware that for both Frodo and Bilbo, it's tragic to have to bear the ring. It's awful to have to bear the ring. And he knows it will do them damage because he has met Gollum. And he knows what could happen to them as a result of taking the ring. So there's the most enormous sympathy and gentleness in his relationship with them both in the early chapters of The Lord of the Rings, and also as his dealings with Frodo right at the end when he leaves them. That's what strikes me most strongly, is this sympathy and understanding about these burdens that he is putting on them. Well, not on Bilbo, because Bilbo got it already, but on Frodo, certainly, and also in getting Bilbo to give it up. It's only just. But he can't even take it. He has to put it on the mantelpiece because he can't trust himself.
Yes,
So that shows you how amazingly heroic these characters really are.
truly. And what of Gandalf's self-awareness to deny himself the ring at points?
Yes, because he's aware that his big kind of temptation is his one, well, not his greatest, but one of his greatest virtues, and that is his mercy. And that's, he himself says this. He says, pity would be my downfall if I took the ring, because I would want to help people. It's a bit like Dostoevsky and the Grand Inquisitor or something in the Brothers Karamazov. He would infantilize everybody. There, dear. Let Uncle Gandalf look after everything. And that would corrode him from within.
Hmm, man.
And this is the end of this is the age of the human that is coming as the elves are fading. And so they do have to grow up. They can't remain these charming little bourgeois hobbits in their little nostalgic fish and chips Edwardian village.
Maybe Tolkien's speaking to himself a bit there, eh?
I think so. I mean, one mustn't kind of over sentimentalize the Shire. It's full of envy and hatred and uncharitableness. There's a reason why Saruman can corrupt them, because they are corruptible. But you're right, he is talking to himself. Though it didn't stop him from, hating the motor car and giving up on it and critiquing the techno-capitalist system for all he's worth.
That's for sure. Uh, I'm curious about Gandalf as a demonstration of the interplay between free will and whether it's sovereignty of God, however, the language around that, knowing Tolkien's very Catholic and very committed to his faith. What are your thoughts on that within the nature of Gandalf?
Well, Gandalf, of course, is the character who talks about providence. Continually, he'll say it was meant that you were to take the ring to Frodo, for example. So he has a sense of providence, but it's very much a Catholic, as you say, view of providence. So it should be distinguished from a reformed view of providence. So there is a much stronger understanding that God works through secondary causes, human free will, not just human free will. I mean, at one point he talks about the will of the ring to go to places and to get itself to places. So, there is a kind of freedom built within the world that that Tolkien portrays, but there is a trust in Gandalf, in providence, that things will work out. And it's particularly impressive because, okay, he's the great strategist. He is the person who even suggests that you take the ring to be unmade. He is the one who determines the fellowship, everything. And yet he's got no idea really how they're going to get rid of, how it's going to happen, because he can't look that far forward. In a sense, providence also has within it a sense of, yes, we have freedom, but we have to negotiate that freedom within circumstances. So it's very much, there's not even a kind of strong kind of deontological thrust. It's a much more virtue ethics approach to morality, where it's character, and you have to trust to character and to relationships to decide what to do at key points. I think that's Gandalf's view of providence. But he does really have it. I mean, one of the bits that I'm particularly interested in is before the battle at the Black Gate scene, where he actually says to Aragorn and the others, we must make ourselves the bait. He will assume, we will put ourselves in the mousetrap. And that is, as I've pointed out in my book, that's the language of atonement theory in the patristic period. You get it in Gregory of Nyssa, you get it in Augustine. The Christ is the cheese in the mousetrap, which tricks the devil because he thinks he's sinned and he can take him, but he hasn't, so he can't. And there's that same sense that they'll misdirect Sauron by making themselves the bait, but it's a huge risk. And I think it relies again upon a providential understanding, which I think that kind of ransomy atonement language sort of signals in the novel. So I think the novel only makes sense within this Catholic understanding of providence rather than a more deterministic one, where you trust to moral luck.
Could you just, from your theological perch or comfy chair, wherever you may be, I I'm curious as to the implication within a person and society with those two strands of thought. As you described, the Catholic notion of providence and free will and the Reformed notion. Could you just articulate a little more specifically what that looks like, if you don't mind, and if not, we can move on.
I mean, I'm not an expert on how modern Reformed theologians would quite articulate this, though I think there is certainly strains that are quite traditionally 16th, 17th century Calvinist in a kind of William Perkins way or something, whereby free will through the fall has been utterly corrupted. Therefore, only God's grace can do anything, and there is, perhaps not so obviously in Calvin himself, but certainly in second and third generation Calvinism going on, a very strong sense of double predestination and determinism in, and the sense that you are the elect, and there is irresistible grace. You cannot fall. In the Catholic view, you can. Your will is no longer upright. It is wounded, in the language of Aquinas, but you can cooperate with God's grace. So although everything is God's grace, God can give you the grace to cooperate. So in a sense, God allows free will, but in the end, all these actions of free will serve a higher purpose. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes. Thank you very much. That's very helpful, because the sort of underlying theme in all of the conversations that we're having on this channel is at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and culture. And of course, works of art like Tolkien's writing and stories are culture downstream of theology and philosophy, and how they interact and interplay and manifest in these stories that have such a rich residue that lingers in the hearts and minds of the hearers and the viewers of the films. And so I think it's very important to attempt at least to trace back to the origins some of these ideas and constructs of how we define the divine and how that then defines and even directs us.
It's interesting, in the Peter Jackson films, they are more determinist. So, for example, Frodo is much more quickly affected by the ring in the films than he is in the stories. It's almost as if a doctrine of total depravity seems to be implicit in the way that he's being played. And this is true because in the film I don't think Faramir is as positively shown. Whereas Faramir exercises his free will and rejects the ring.
Yes.
But it isn't so clear in the film.
Yeah, you're right. Interesting. Especially the point to Frodo and, as you say, the sort of winding nature of it in the book versus the directness of the film. Well, I'd love to talk on just a couple more things, but the penultimate point, at least for today's conversation, being the most well-known scene of Gandalf's role, and that is his death and his disappearance with the Balrog, and his resurrection as Gandalf the White. How does that reinforce Tolkien's Christological worldview? I mean, that's very kind of straightforward, but I'd love for you just to speak on that whole arc within Gandalf as part of the story.
I think we need to be very careful when we talk about the Christological, because Tolkien is very, very aware that we're talking about a world that cannot save itself. The only reason in the end the ring falls is that Gollum tries to bite it off and then he topples and he falls in. Now, evil destroys itself, but there's no way that Frodo can act like Christ and resist temptation. He can't, poor poppet. You know, he's totally, he's been worn down by this horrible ring. And the same way, Gandalf, although the scene in which Gandalf is resurrected, and I think we can use those terms because it's very clear that he even says, I think, that he died. I can't quite remember, but I think it's very clear that he is brought back to life by higher forces. And it looks like Christ transfigured on the mountain. You know, he's shining white just like Christ, and his power is stronger, but not, you know, he's got a new authority because he is now the chief wizard. He has been brought back. Saruman has forfeited his role as the chief of the Astari. It is now Gandalf, and he has the authority of one who has suffered. And in that sense, it is Christological. So lots and lots of characters in the story act as foreshadowings of Christ-like actions. So obviously, Gandalf sacrifices himself. He breaks the bridge, and then he goes down and fights the Balrog. So, you know, and then he is resurrected. So there is a sacrificial element. But I shouldn't think he does have authority. So he only has to appear at the gates of Gondor, and that has a huge effect. But for example, he can't force, again, free will, he can't force Denethor to do the right thing. So his authority is still limited, but he has been revealed for what he is, what he always has been in one sense.
Mm-hmm.
But so his authority is stronger because he's now the chief Istari, but in a sense he always was Gandalf the White, if you like. He's just stronger for that sacrificial action, really, I think. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else that he does that has an absolutely instant effect. I mean, I mentioned Guahir right at the beginning, and you wonder whether he doesn't know that story when he says, I would do anything for you, which is a new development in their relationship. His sort of self-giving. But I mean, Aragorn always accepts his authority because it's his wisdom that Aragorn should take the paths of the dead, for example. And so in that sense, his authority is heightened,
Mm-hmm.
but not too much.
Right, right. And yes, as you point out, it's harder for him to be disguised. Not not just because of the revelation of his fullness, as it were, but once other people have that awareness, right? It no matter what costume you may put on, they know what's underneath.
That's right. He's on Shadowfax too, you know,
Yeah.
who, again, another of his relationships. You know, Shadowfax and he love each other, and therefore Shadowfax will come. And he is a
So
horse beyond horses.
right.
On a
What
white
what?
horse, he's coming along.
Oh, what a scene! What child
Darling having
wouldn't
a
want?
horse.
I can't imagine there's a child out there who wouldn't want Shadowfax to come for them. Um, just beautiful. Um, you mentioned Aragorn. Just last thought on that. Anything with respect to Gandalf's relationship to Aragorn that is particularly compelling or enjoyable in your estimation?
I think it's Gandalf who's responsible for Aragorn's career and telling him to spend all this time in a kind of kenotic, which means self-emptying kind of manner, guarding the Shire, working for Gondor, working for the Rohirrim, when he is the true king. Yet kingship only comes through a period of humility and service, because the model of kingship is a very high one for Tolkien. Tolkien believes in kings, but the whole point about a king is that the king stands for the divine grounding of a society, and therefore has to have a certain kind of humility. So in our own coronation service, the king put on a kind of servant's diaconal robe in order to be anointed. And of course, Gandalf does the crowning of Aragorn. So he is determinative of Aragorn's whole way of being, that makes him the true king, only because he is the one who serves, and none of the others do in quite that way. Though, of course, Theoden gives himself at the front of his army to the battle and dies. So that's the right way a king should behave. Thor, who is, of course, a steward anyway, is not, because all he thinks of is Gondor, and all he thinks of is his own role within it. He doesn't have a sense of the higher good, the common good. It's pure Catholic social teaching in Tolkien, and particularly Gandalf particularly represents parts of that. The idea of subsidiarity, the idea that power should be devolved to the lowest possible level. So, okay, you've got a king, but you've also got a self-governing local shire, and you've got a kind of balance between those different kinds of power.
Thank you so much. This has been so lovely chatting with you. So good to see you. I'm curious if you have any parting thoughts about Gandalf or anything broader with Tolkien as we conclude our conversation.
Well, I think I would emphasize this attention to the small. Sorry, I had to put a light on. Ooh, there we go.
There we go.
Which I think is so important. Can I just read a quotation?
Please.
This is him talking to Denethor. But I will say this, the rule of no realm is mine, neither of Gondor nor any other great or small, but all worthy things that are in peril, as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail of my task, though Gondor should perish, if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair, or bear fruit and flower again in days to come. For I also am a steward. So again, that attention to the small, and the pity comes out of that as well. That's the only thing we haven't talked about, his pity for Gollum, which has this huge providential role in the story. And that's because Gollum too is one of the small things, and he sees even in him a possibility of reclamation.
I love that so much. My goodness, it's one of my. It's just beautiful that Gollum, somewhere in there, Smeagol is still alive.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just agreeing.
Well, if you've got just a couple more minutes, I kind of would love for you to touch on that. I'm sorry we overlooked it because I do think it is so paramount in my own takeaway from these stories and how I'm to live in the world. So, would you touch on the relationship between Gandalf and Gollum?
Yeah, so, I mean, Gandalf finds Gollum and realizes some of his backstory. He is aware that he is very, very corrupted by the ring, but he is able to see both the Smeagol that he was and the Gollum that he's become. And he warns Frodo at key points to have mercy on Gollum. And of course, the sad thing is that just when Gollum was beginning to show signs of fellow feeling for Frodo, Sam interposes and it goes wrong. But yet he is there, and although obviously he's fighting Frodo at the end, he serves the purposes of Providence in the end. So even evil serves the good despite itself, or even in the case of Gollum, in its mixed nature. And that's all down to Gandalf. I mean, he saves Saruman, of course. He lets Saruman just go on his way. Okay, he was supposed to be locked up at one point, but he got his way out of it. Again, by people being merciful, the Ents being too merciful. And yet, you might even say that the scouring of the Shire at the end was, in a sense, necessary. That corruption was already coming. And in the way that it happened, it led to a better Shire and to, the restoration of authority through Merry and Pippin and Sam and their actions. So even mercy at every point, even when it seems to fail, actually succeeds. So that's a lesson for us all.
That is the best lesson I have heard in many a day. So thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting with you.
It's a pleasure, Derek. Thank you for having me.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by Frodo's Lament for Gandalf, a poem by J.R.R. Tolkien. Let us begin. When evening in the Shire was grey, his footsteps on the hill were heard. Before the dawn he went away, on journey long without a word. From wilderland to western shore, from northern waste to southern hill, through dragon lair and hidden door, and darkling woods he walked at will. With dwarf and hobbit, elves and men, with mortal and immortal folk, with bird on bough and beast in den, in their own secret tongues he spoke. A deadly sword, a healing hand, a back that bent beneath its load, a trumpet voice, a burning brand, a weary pilgrim on the road. A lord of wisdom, throned he sat, swift in anger, quick to laugh, an old man in a battered hat, who leaned upon a thorny staff. He stood upon the bridge alone, and fire and shadow both defied. His staff was broken on the stone, in Khazad-dûm his wisdom died. Thank you, J.R.R. Tolkien, for Frodo's Lament for Gandalf, and for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.